So we're in chapter 4 of Galatians. We're making good progress. We're going to cover a number of verses today. Basically everything up to the allegory. So let's remember very briefly what we had before. In the previous section, in chapter 3, Shaul began explaining his understanding of Torah. If you reread that chapter recently, you saw how he's trying to explain this relationship of Torah in Israel's life. And so he touched a little bit on the topic of childhood. He spoke about being immature, being under the tutelage, being under the guardianship of Torah, being a baby, just babysat by the law, right? Mm-hmm. And despite some interpretations that you may have heard before, it's actually a good image of Torah. It's a positive one. It's somebody who takes care of you, a guardian. Is really a positive picture of Torah. Well, now he continues with the same theme of being a child of God. Someone who has an amazing inheritance to inherit, but this example he turns in more of a negative explanation. And he wishes to present another reality of Torah to his audience. The traditional Jewish way of teaching is analogy. It's very, very common. Everybody uses it. And just as a matter of saying, I'll remind you that analogy means something that is similar, not necessarily the same. Similar, not the same. This is what an analogy is. And so it's a very common way of teaching. Yeshua taught that way. Shaul teaches that way. The entire Brit Chadashah is full of analogies because the Semitic mind just wants to go there naturally. This is how people relate the scripture to life and back and forth. So Shaul is very fond of analogies. So in verse 1, let's read 1 through 3 in chapter 4. And we'll stop there. We'll see what Shaul says. Verses 1 through 3 in chapter 4. Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the father. So also we, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. So in verse 1, Shaul says that a child, though he's the owner of an inheritance, eventually he's the owner of his father's house. He's actually no different than a slave. It's a very kind of loud statement. But before you go thinking too deep about what that means, I want to caution you. Once again, I'm going to caution you about the reading into this context, the idea of American slavery. Don't think American slavery when you hear the word slave in Brit Chadashah. Don't think about it that way, because this is a very different experience. The Roman world was different. In ancient Rome, a slave was not free, but he did have rights. In a sense, he wasn't free completely, but he did have a lot of rights. He actually could sue his master in court. People don't realize that. In the Roman world, slaves were not poor. The slaves were always taken care of. They were always fed. They were always clothed. Basic medical care was provided to them. Sometimes they were educated. And sometimes they held important managerial positions in the household. Slaves could have personal property, but also slaves were bound to their master until a slave worked his way out to freedom or was released out of his service by the master. So also remember that the servant and slave in biblical languages means the same. There's whatsoever no difference. Like today we make a difference between slave and servant. To us this means an entirely different thing. But in ancient biblical languages, whether it be Greek or Hebrew, there's actually no difference between a word slave or servant. You kind of have to assume and not be sure always when you hear that word, well, what does he mean by that word? You have to kind of read into it and say, what kind of servant? What kind of slave? Is it really a slave or is it a servant? Shaul calls himself a bond servant of Yeshua. So think about that imagery. It's the lines are blurred in that ancient society, in the ancient world about slavery. But I do have to caution you not to base your idea of slavery in the Bible on slavery and the American experience, the American model, and the abuses that happened here in America. That's what people remember. That's what's fresh in their mind. That's what they were taught, and that is where their mind runs. But that is a mistake to do it this way. Let's think of a slave. I'm going to put a new paradigm in your mind. Let's think of a slave as someone who is limited in his abilities, not totally free to exercise all of his potential. So think of a slave that way. So Shaul here compares a child to a slave, because though he is the master, the employer of those who take care of him, who teach him, who manage him, he is unable to exercise his rights as the master. What happens is, until the date set by his father, not until he is mature, he cannot give orders to his guardians. So here he is the master, yet he's being bossed around. They tell him when to go to sleep. They tell him how much homework he has to do. They tell him he cannot have a cake for breakfast. They tell him when he has to take a nap, and he has to brush his teeth before going to bed. They tell him, they organize his life for them. They force him to do these things, and he has no choice. He's being bossed around by the people who are on the payroll of his father. And so here he is. He is his father's heir. So though he is a son, he's treated as if he was a servant or a slave. He doesn't have all the rights, limited rights. He's confined. He's not allowed to do what he wants or when he wants. He has no choice but to obey. So it's a curious analogy that Shaul develops out of this idea that a child of the master is still a slave. So in verse 3, I hope you see that Shaul says that we, and we can mean a number of things, could mean Jews or simply a collective reference to mankind. He says we were children, we were minors, we were immature in our development. When we were such, we were held in slavery, we were held in servanthood. And what was holding us? Look at this, the elemental things of this world. Now, there are several possible translations of this term. You may have slightly different ways your translations put that down. But essentially, whichever translation you're reading, it's probably a little bit ambiguous there. You're probably looking at it and you're saying, what is this? Elemental principles of the world. What are these powers, that are on there? This is somewhat of a kind of a mysterious Greek term. And that's why we have to understand exactly what it means, because everything hangs on this term, actually, in this analogy. If you don't understand what these elemental things are, then we're stuck. The term in Greek is stoicheon, and what it means, stoicheon is a noun that means a couple of things. I'll give you a couple of meanings. It means natural substances. It means materials of the universe. It means supernatural powers sometimes. Sometimes it means basic principles, or it means elementary truths. So that's kind of nebulous. See what I just gave you, all these definitions, that doesn't really help, does it? You're saying, how can I make sense of all this? It seems so abstract, hard to understand. Well, it's a concept, it's a picture you have to understand. See, well, I believe that sometimes when we can't understand what the noun is, we have to look at the verb. And nouns and verbs are connected, they come from each other, and they're usually very much related to each other, so some of the meanings may become a little clearer when we look at the verb. And so I looked up the word stoicheo, and stoicheo means to behave, or to adhere to a standard, to imitate some pattern. That's what storcheo means. So studying the use of this term in literature, as we look around how it's being used, it helps to clarify its meaning just a little bit. Having reflected on what this verb of this mysterious noun means, the connection between the verb and the noun is obvious. We can clarify it a little bit more. So let's see if I can simplify the meaning for us so that it's not as ambiguous, so we can actually plug it into the sentence and see that it makes sense. So here's my suggestion what storcheon means. We can translate it as pattern. We can say that it means the order of things, whether it's natural or supernatural. We can say that it's a system or basic structure. It has to do with how things work and how the governing principles work and why they work. That's what storcheon means. The elemental powers of the world, the elemental things of the world is basically a system, a structure, a pattern, an order. That's what we're talking about. So what does Shaul mean when he says that we are enslaved by the order of things? What does he mean when he says we're enslaved by the pattern of the world, by this system? Well, he means that we follow the natural flow, how the world works. We come into this world and we just float in it. It's natural. This is the way we've always known it. This is the way that it appears. We don't question it. We just go with the flow. The natural world, however, if you remember, we spoke about this before, was broken. The natural world is cursed. And so we are a part of a system that is broken and cursed. A system that we may not even realize that we are part of. We may not realize it's cursed and broken. We're not even realizing that it's a system because we've always been a part of it and we can't see ourselves outside of it. So we may not even realize our position. So when he says that we were enslaved or subject to or subjugated or ruled or controlled by these elemental powers of the world, by the storcheon, but meaning by this system, by the pattern, how this world works. What is he talking about? Well, maybe the next verses will clarify it a little bit more. Let's read 4 and 5. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Shaul says in verse 4 here that the fullness of time came, meaning the hour determined by the Father when the child is mature came. That's what he's talking about. Remember, the Father determines when the child is ready, when he's mature, when he can become the master and no longer a slave. So that fullness of time came. And we attained maturity. Now we're ready for the next stage. So Adonai sends his Son, so we might receive adoption, he says. Well, the word here is actually something like sonship or sonliness. I don't know. It doesn't translate from Greek exactly into English. It's a noun, but it doesn't mean adoption. It just means sonliness, sonship, sonhood, whatever you want to say. It is a noun, but it is when a child becomes truly a son. Remember that to be a son implies more than just being an offspring. To be a true son of somebody means to resemble that person in some concrete way, means to have the same values, means to reflect in some way the connection that exists between the Father and the Son. I mean, you see this in Yeshua. He's very clear in saying that whatever the Father says I do, me and the Father are one. These kinds of things. So he explains to us the proper relationship of what it means truly being a son, not merely an offspring of someone. So, when we say in our society today, oh, he's his father's son, or something like that, well, what do we mean? Well, we mean that he really reflects who his father is. That they're so much alike, that they have the similar characteristics. So, you see, you can be a child This is what Shaul is saying. You can be a child and never really be a son. So, when we become a son is when we attain to that maturity and start following the same values that the Father has been teaching us. When we finally get it, and we no longer follow values that the Father has been trying to teach us through our nannies and governors and teachers and schoolmasters. All these values have been taught to us, and we have been following them because of the stick. But there's a moment comes when we mature, and we don't follow them because somebody's standing there with a stick over us. We follow them because we want to. Well, at that moment, we're mature. At that moment, we become our Father's sons, our Father's daughters. That's at the moment we become truly children of the Father who bore us. So that's one of the ideas that we have to kind of have in our mind when he means being a son versus being an offspring. So son means being like a father in many ways. Notice over here in this verse, I don't want to skip this out. This is an important point here. It says that the son was born of a woman. Why does he say that? Who was born of a man? Why is that important? A son born of a woman. Well, that means that he's part of the system of this world. You see, if he just came down from the sky, that'd be different, right? Because he would be outside of the system. But we're all under these elemental principles of the world, right? We're part of the system. We're part of this pattern, this natural life that we just came into. So he is born into this very natural life, born of a woman, part of the system, naturally. And says that he was under the law, meaning that he had to live in the same confinement and limitations as the rest. He had to live in the same environment as everybody else. Had to have the teachers, and the governors and the headmasters, and so that somehow he made our maturity possible, it says in this verses. So because he came, our maturity came. See, our maturity is tied to him and his coming. Now how, that's a little bit difficult to comprehend because he doesn't tell us exactly how, but we do get the sense that Shaul says that our maturity is there because of his coming. He came so we can become sons. And Shaul shifts a little gears right here. And he continues with analogies of being children of God. Look at verses 6 through 9. Let's read. Let's actually read 6 through 11 and discuss these. Because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. However, at that time when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which by nature are no gods. But now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental things to which you desire to be enslaved all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. So look at verses 6 and on now, 6 through 9 particularly. In verse 6, Shaul shifts pronouns. Did you notice? It was we before, and now it is you. Now, every time, pronouns are important. People don't realize how important this is. This tells you who he's talking about. And sometimes pronoun makes the meaning of the verse. It changes everything. So he was talking we, now he's all of a sudden talking you. That's a different person. First person versus second person, And so you are sons, he says. Well, who are sons? Well, Galatians. He says, you are sons, and now Hashem sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts. The Spirit that cries, Abba, Father. So into our hearts. See that again. There's another pronoun. So God sends the Spirit into our hearts. Whose hearts? Not just your hearts, because you must be Galatians. And so who's our? Our, he probably includes himself and the people who are writing this letter together with him into this. So now this is all collective. And so God has sent the Spirit into all of our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. But verse 7. Verse 7 says that once you have the Spirit of the Son inside you, you must be son yourself. Because you wouldn't have it otherwise, right? And if you are a son, if you were adopted, if you were taken in as son, then you are an heir. That means if you have an inheritance of some sort. And God is the one who did the adoption, obviously, right? Because it's his action. He's the one who sends the Spirit into you. So if you have it, that means he has taken you to himself. That's the sign that you need, that you're his. Once Shaul, shifted the pronoun to you, he continues talking to Galatians here, directly. In verse 8 he says that there was a time that they, Galatians, did not know God and were slaves to things which are not God's by nature. I hope you saw that. The question is, who is this referring to? Does it refer to idols? Maybe. I think it would become clear who Galatians were slaves to before or prior if we just keep reading just a little bit further. Verse 9 continues. Now that you and God have relationship, why do you want to turn back to the weak and worthless elemental things? Why do you want to be slaves to them again? So they were slaves to them before, now they want to be slaves to them again. Do you catch the logic of Shaul here? Now we see Galatians who were enslaved, enslaved before what they were enslaved to. He says right here very clearly, weak elemental things. So if you were to guess, you will guess right that this is our mysterious term, stoicheon, again. That one that is so hard to understand because nobody knows what in the world it means. Which we determined that what it really means, it means the pattern, the system, or the natural order of things. So what they were slaves to is the pattern, the natural order of things, the system of the world, a fallen, broken world in which they were born into. I cannot tell you how many people do not understand this verse because they never took the time to understand what stoicheon means, what that strange elemental things of the world, however it's translated in your translation. They never took the time to figure out what that means, and so therefore they get so confused by this one verse and it throws everything off, and then they can't understand the bigger passage, what it's talking about. So he basically says to Galatians, you have entered into a supernatural relationship with God because now you are his adoptive sons through Yeshua, and now you want to go back to the previous state of being as a slave to the natural system, to the pattern of this world that everybody has followed. See, you have had a supernatural breakthrough in your life, and you want to go back to the natural things the way they were before and pretend that supernatural didn't happen to you? This is what he's saying. That would be to deny that supernatural work of God that happened in them, the Spirit of Messiah that came and transformed them from the inside. To go back to the way things were before would be to deny that. Well, what is he meaning when to go back to the way things were before? What is he talking about? Guess what? He's talking about the circumcision. Why is that the natural things? Remember that Galatians wanted to become sons of Abraham. They wanted to have an inheritance, because how can you have an inheritance of Abraham? Only if you are the son of Abraham you can have the inheritance of Abraham. So if you're going to have the inheritance of Abraham, if you're going to have the promises of God that he gave to Abraham, then you do it through circumcision. You do it through conversion to a Jewish way of life. That's the only way, a natural way to do so. You become natural sons of Abraham by a natural process of natural adoption. There's nothing supernatural about it. Circumcision. Nothing supernatural. It's not magic. It doesn't happen because it's a human way, a human institution of becoming a part of something. That's what it is. But you see, but that is a natural path. While what God has done to them is a supernatural path through the Spirit. See, this is what Shaul is putting in opposition to each other. It's the supernatural act of God through his Spirit versus the act that they want to do through circumcision, which would be a very fleshly, very natural way. 'Cause that's what everybody does. But God has done something different within them. So verse 10 is one of those, one of the reasons why people misread this passage as well. Because it says that you observe days and months and seasons, right? You notice that? Many people right here read Judaism, right there. The feasts, the Sabbaths, and etc., and etc., etc. Well, who else does those things but the Jews, right? But it doesn't say so, does it? The text actually doesn't say anything about Judaism there. It doesn't say anything about the feasts, doesn't say anything about the Sabbaths, nothing specific at all. So it's a total guess, a total assumption to think that it has something to do with being Jewish or Jewish calendar or any of that matter. But read the commentaries. Go pick up any popular commentary on Galatians. I guarantee you that's what you're going to read. Most of the commentators will say that very thing. Yet there's nothing about Judaism here at all. And why would this action of going to, feasts or Sabbaths or Jewish calendar, why would that constitute going back to the system? Because remember, it says you're returning to the elemental things, to the weak elemental things of the world. Well, guess what? Did Galatians practice Jewish calendar before the Spirit of the Messiah came into them? No, so how can they go back to that which they've never practiced before? So you see, this is where the logic becomes quite incoherent and circular. If this is Judaism, then how can they go back to Judaism? Because they've never been to Judaism. Actually, they're trying to get there now. See, what were they practicing before? Something fishy here. So there's no Judaism here in plain view. And if you know pagan religions, if you studied pagan religions at all, you would know that they're very superstitious. You would know that they have sophisticated calendars, and they have calendars with good days and bad days, like horoscope. Everyone is familiar with horoscope? Those of you who are familiar with horoscope, you can tell me, because people read it and they say, okay, today is a good day to do this and this and that. Well, tomorrow is a bad day to take a trip, so don't go on a trip. It tells you good days, bad days, favorable times, unfavorable times. Today's a good day for business, but don't make any of this and that. Tomorrow is a bad day for making decisions, so don't make any decisions tomorrow. It tells you these things. This is nothing new. This is the same paganism that people have embraced for millennia. And so, guess what? Folk religions, pagan religions have plenty of calendars and times and seasons and ordinances and things that they actually practice and celebrate and follow religiously. Jews are not the only ones who are crazy about following a calendar and a pattern. So, they believe that the stars, the moon, the sky, everything, the positioning of everything influences people's lives, and based on that, they organize their lives. So, no, most likely, my friends, Galatians are talking about returning to some form of previous superstitious, calendar-driven lifestyle, basically. That's what they're probably returning to. Maybe somehow they're tying this to Judaism, because maybe they're seeing the similarity between the Jewish peculiarity of following the calendar dates and the way that they lived before, so they're kind of getting back into that pattern of life. So Shaul voices his doubt right here in verse 11 and says, I'm wondering whether I've been working with you for nothing. I'm wondering if this was all good, if all of I've done, didn't do any good to you. So it's a complicated passage, but I think it's a little tricky to understand. But now that we have determined what this term elemental things of the world means, it makes it a lot easier to make sense of. So let's read on verses 12 through 16. It gets a little bit easier as we go along. I beg of you, brethren, because become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You have done me no wrong, but you know that it was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you the first time, and that which was a trial to you in my bodily condition, you did not despise or loathe, but you received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself. Where then is the sense of blessing you had? For I bear you witness that if possible you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me. So have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? This verse 12 can be a little bit tricky to understand, and the rest of the passage is a lot easier, actually. Verse 12 says, become like me, I've become like you. What in the world does that mean? It's kind of enigmatic. I mean, he could mean so many different things by that. Like, we understand the gist of what he's saying, but what is he putting behind those words? What is the actual background of what it means, become like me, I've become like you? In which way have I become like you? In which way are you supposed to become like me? That's the question that we should be asking. In which way they should be alike? So, a couple of options I'll give you. And these are completely speculative because I tell you honestly, I have no idea. There's no way that I can determine for 100% certainty what he means when he says, become like me because I've become like you. There are multiple options out there. Here, I'll give you the two most kind of reasonable ones for me. Two possibilities. Option number one, what he's saying is that, and this could be a little bit of a stretch. What he's saying is, I am persecuted and people oppose me because of my teachings. I'm persecuted and you are persecuted because you're in between. So it's okay. Be in between. Be persecuted. I am in between. You're in between. I've become like you by going out on a limb and saying that circumcision is not necessary to people who have the Spirit of God living in their hearts. That is evidence enough that they belong to God, that they need to get circumcised. And I'm being persecuted for preaching that. And it says, and you're being persecuted by continuing to live in the righteous way, yet not becoming fully Jewish in a society which is so pagan. And here you're stuck in between, and I'm stuck in between. Your people are not understanding you. I'm going up against you, and my own people are not understanding what in the world I am talking about, because they don't understand the Spirit of God that has come into you. So maybe that's what he means when he says, become like me, for I've become like you. Maybe. Another option is he could say that, understand me as I understand you. It can simply be an idiom, almost like a saying. It could be a phrase that simply means, understand me as I understand you. I have become as a father to you, and I'm attached to you, so reciprocate to me the love that I have for you. That could be another possible option. It can simply mean that, just a way of expressing his relationship to his disciples. Again, like I said, there's absolutely no way that we can be 100% certain what that phrase means. But regardless, if you understand the bigger idea that the verse expresses and the rest of the passage, then it really doesn't change the meaning of the words that follow. So verses 13 and 14 suggest that Shaul was sick, and it seems that his sickness made him stop on his journey. And this is where they met. This is where he met Galatians. So he got sick, he stopped, and he preached the gospel to them because of his sickness. He couldn't go anymore. He was on his way, and he had to make a stop. And so there he was stopped in Galatia, and this is where he preached the good news to them. That's how they became believers. They probably took care of him. It says that they accepted him as a messenger of God, even as Messiah himself. They were hospitable to him. Whatever was wrong with him, they took care of him. That becomes apparent from these verses. So he's saying, why not accept my words now as you accepted them before? Before you were gracious to me, you were hospitable to me. You didn't have any animosity towards me. You accepted me for who I was, even in my sick condition, and you believed me. Why can't you accept me now the same way you did before? What happened to Galatians that they cannot treat Shaul today the same way they treated him before? And that's what he's wondering about. It's a rhetorical question, sort of say. So Shaul says in verses 15 and 16, he continues, that you had a blessing in your lives, and you showed kindness to me beyond measure. You had that kind of love for me, and where is that love now? What he's trying to say is something has happened to them, and the condition that they have now is worse than the condition that they had when he first met them, when they were not believers yet. That's a little bit tough to take. He says, you wanted to pluck out your own eyes and give them to me. Now you treat me as an enemy because you do not like what I'm telling you? It's possible that plucking out their own eyes is an idiom. Basically meaning you would have done anything for me. You know? But it's possible that it's quite literal, because many people believe that Shaul had a sickness that was connected to his vision, that he had a hard time seeing. He had some kind of problem with his eyes. And so that would have made sense why he would stop, and that would have made sense why he would say something like, you would have plucked out your own eyes to help me, because I couldn't see, and you were willing to do that. So again, he's just trying to show to them that they were so merciful, they had so much love towards them, and they don't have that now. So the overall idea of becoming like me as I've become like you becomes very clear here. We see it. The big idea is Shaul misses his feeling, his connection to his disciples, the mutual feelings that they had for each other before, and he says, I missed that. What happened? Why did it go away? You treated me this way, now you treat me completely different. So this is what he's talking about, in a very kind of fatherly way to them. So look at verses 17 through 20. This is through the end of our passage today. I'm going to read 17 through 20. They eagerly seek you, not commendably, but they wish to shut you out so that you will seek them. But it is good always to be eagerly sought in a commendable manner, and not only when I am present with you. My children, with whom I am again in labor, until Christ is formed in you. But I could wish to be present with you now, and to change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. Now this really makes it sound like a letter. I mean, you hear him, at some points he gets all teachy, and he gets all these examples, but at another point you really realize that what you're reading is correspondence between people. You're reading a very personal letter, a very touching letter about people who had relationships that were quite deep. So in verses 17 through 18, what we see is Shaul telling about those who came to confuse Galatians. He does not name them, he refers to them as they. That's it. We don't know who they are. So all the commentaries on Galatians you read about Judaizers and this and the party of circumcision and this, and all the titles that people have made up for these ambiguous people who came to confuse Galatians, they're all completely 100% speculation, because he actually never names them. He doesn't tell us who they are. He just continues to call them they, and that's it. Apparently these people are zealous for Galatians, and Shaul, he applauds their zeal, but he sees another motivation in this intense desire. He says that they wish to alienate Galatians from Shaul. So this is a tactic. The tactic is quite simple. Once they're alienated from Shaul, who is their spiritual father, Galatians will have no other place to turn for advice and instruction but to these very people. And then they will be sought by Galatians. So these people want to be sought after, but the only way they're going to get sought after is to cut Shaul off from these people. Then they'll have nowhere to turn. Then they'll have to come to them for teaching and instruction, because there's nobody else to go to. So you see, he sees a little agenda here. In verses 19 and 20, let's look at a little something else. Shaul compares Galatians with children, and he says that he's like a mother in labor. Very, very intimate, tender language. He says, I'm like a mother in labor with you. That's how he feels. He says Messiah has to be fully manifested in his disciples. This means that their maturity is not yet complete, and at this moment, it feels to him like birth pains. Basically, he is going through the agony at this moment. He is stressing out about what's happening with them. They're not ready. So he's really worried about them, and he wishes he can come and see them. He wishes he can speak face to face to them. He wishes he can say nice things to them, but right now his tone is stern. He has no choice but to write this stern letter, basically. That's what he's ready. Because remember, he calls them foolish Galatians. You who have no sense, is what he tells them in this letter, several times. So he uses these stern words. Well, with this appeal to personal history Shaul had with Galatians, Shaul returns to the topic of sonship, being children of God, and in the next verses, once again, only this time in an allegory, we will see how the topic of sonship is discussed yet one more time. So that we will discuss in our next session.